Picture this. A single slave, chained and broken, standing in the blood-soaked sand of a gladiatorial arena. The crowd roars for his death. Rome, the most powerful empire the world has ever known, expects him to die for their entertainment. But instead of dying, he does something unthinkable. He picks up his sword, rallies 70 other desperate men, and declares war on the greatest military machine in human history. Within months, that slave army grows to 70,000 warriors. They defeat Roman legion after Roman legion, humiliating generals and consuls. They march through Italy like a storm, liberating slaves, burning estates, and turning the social order upside down. The Senate panics. The Republic trembles. And one man's name becomes synonymous with rebellion itself. That man was Spartacus. But here's what most people don't know. We almost have no idea who he really was. His true origins are shrouded in mystery. His motivations remain debated by historians to this day. And the way his rebellion ended is one of the most brutal and haunting images in all of ancient history. 6,000 crucified rebels lining the Appian Way for miles, a forest of crosses, as a warning to anyone who dared dream of freedom. So who was Spartacus? Was he a hero fighting for liberty? A tactical genius? Or simply a desperate man who refused to die quietly? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most legendary figures, the gladiator who made Rome bleed. Stay with me, because this story is far more complex, brutal, and fascinating than any movie could ever capture. Let's start with a frustrating truth. We don't really know where Spartacus came from. The ancient sources disagree on almost everything about his early life. What we do know is fragmentary, often contradictory, and filtered through the lens of Roman historians who viewed him as a dangerous criminal rather than hero. Most scholars believe Spartacus was a Thracian, a tribal warrior from what is now modern-day Bulgaria. Thrace was a rugged, mountainous region known for producing fierce fighters. The Thracians were considered barbarians by the Romans, but they were also respected for their combat skills and often recruited as auxiliary troops in the Roman army. Here's where it gets interesting. Some sources suggest Spartacus actually served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman military before becoming a slave. Think about that for a moment. He may have fought for Rome before he fought against it. He would have learned Roman military tactics, understood their strategies, and witnessed their discipline firsthand. This knowledge would later prove devastatingly effective when he turned those same tactics against his former masters. But how did a soldier become a gladiator slave? The most likely explanation is desertion. Roman military discipline was absolutely brutal. Soldiers faced harsh conditions, and deserters were punished with death or enslavement. If Spartacus deserted, perhaps refusing to fight in a war he didn't believe in, or trying to return to his homeland, he would have been captured, enslaved, and sold. And where do you send a strong, combat-trained slave? To the gladiatorial schools. Spartacus ended up in Capua, at the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, one of the most prestigious gladiatorial training schools in Italy. But calling it a school is misleading. These were prisons. The gladiators lived in cells, were chained at night, and trained under constant supervision. They were property, assets to be bet on in the arena. Their only purpose was to kill or die for entertainment. But Spartacus wasn't just any gladiator. Ancient sources describe him as intelligent, cultured, and possessing a natural leadership quality that set him apart. One historian even noted that he was more Greek than Thracian in character, suggesting he had education and refinement unusual for a slave. This wasn't just some mindless brute. This was a thinking, strategic mind trapped in a nightmare. And he was planning something extraordinary. The year was 73 BC. Rome was at the height of its power, but the Republic was also beginning to crack from within. Political corruption was rampant, wealth inequality was extreme, and the slave population had swelled to unprecedented numbers. Some estimates suggest that for every free Roman, there were 2 or 3 slaves. Italy was a powder keg, and Spartacus was about to light the fuse. The plan was simple but desperate. Spartacus and about 70 fellow gladiators decided they would rather die fighting for freedom than continue dying for entertainment. Using kitchen utensils as weapons, knives, spits, anything they could grab, they fought their way out of the ludus. Imagine the chaos. Trained killers Men who had survived countless arena battles, suddenly armed and unleashed. The guards never stood a chance. The gladiators burst out of school and fled into the countryside. But here's what makes this different from a typical slave revolt. Spartacus didn't just run. He immediately began organizing. This wasn't a panicked escape. It was the beginning of a military campaign. The fugitives needed weapons, so they raided a wagon carrying gladiatorial equipment. Suddenly, they had proper arms. They needed a defensible position, so they made for Mount Vesuvius. Yes, the same volcano that would destroy Pompeii about 150 years later. The mountain offered natural fortification, and the slopes were covered with wild grapevines, providing both cover and resources. Word of the escape spread like wildfire through the slave communities of southern Italy, and slaves began to escape and join them. 10 more, then 50, then hundreds. Agricultural slaves, household slaves, slaves from the mines. They came in droves, seeing in Spartacus something they had long given up hoping for, a chance. Rome's initial response was dismissive. The Senate sent a small militia force under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber with about 3,000 men. How dangerous could a band of escaped slaves really be? They were about to find out. Glaber's forces surrounded Mount Vesuvius, cutting off the only path down. He planned to starve them out. It seemed like a sound strategy. The gladiators were trapped on top of a mountain with no escape route. But Spartacus had other plans. Using the wild grapevines growing on the mountainside, the rebels wove ladders and ropes. Under cover of darkness, they descended the sheer cliffs on the opposite side of the mountain, the side no one was guarding because it was considered unclimbable. They circled around and launched a surprise attack on the Roman camp from behind. Glaber's forces were caught completely off guard. They were routed, the militia scattered, and suddenly, Spartacus had a huge stockpile of Roman military equipment. Rome's first encounter with Spartacus ended in humiliating defeat, and the rebellion had just begun. After the victory at Vesuvius, everything changed. Spartacus was no longer just a fugitive. He was a symbol. Slaves across southern Italy heard about the impossible victory and began escaping in massive numbers to join the rebellion. The rebel army swelled to tens of thousands. At its peak, ancient sources claim it reached between 70,000 and 120,000 people. Now, these numbers might be exaggerated. Ancient historians often inflated figures, but even conservative estimates put the rebel force at around 50,000 to 70,000. Think about what that means. This wasn't just an army of trained gladiators anymore. This was a mass movement of agricultural workers, household servants, miners, and craftsmen. People who had never held a weapon before. Spartacus had to somehow forge this diverse, desperate mass of humanity into a fighting force capable of taking on Roman legions. And, incredibly, he succeeded. Spartacus proved to be a brilliant military commander. He organized the army into units, established discipline, and implemented training regimens. He held councils of war with other rebel leaders, including Crassus, a Gallic gladiator who became one of his chief lieutenants, and Unanswered, another prominent commander. But here's something fascinating. Spartacus tried to impose rules on his army that were unusual for any military force of that era, let alone a slave rebellion. He reportedly forbade his soldiers from hoarding gold and silver, wanting to prevent greed from corrupting the movement. He tried to maintain discipline and prevent random atrocities against civilians, though this wasn't always successful. Why would he do this? Most historians believe Spartacus understood something crucial. He wasn't just leading a slave revolt. He was trying to maintain an army that could survive long-term against Rome. Random pillaging would turn the local population against them and make them look like bandits rather than rebels. Discipline would give them legitimacy and, more importantly, operational effectiveness. Rome sent more forces. A praetor named Publius Varinius marched south with 2 legions. Spartacus defeated him too. Then he defeated Varinius's lieutenants in separate engagements. The rebel army was now defeating professional Roman forces in open battle. The Senate was no longer dismissing this as a minor disturbance. This was a crisis. During 73 to 72 BCE, Spartacus and his army ranged throughout southern Italy, defeating every Roman force sent against them. They captured towns, liberated more slaves, and acquired vast amounts of weapons and supplies. For slaves across the empire, Spartacus became a legend, proof that Rome could be challenged, that freedom was possible. But there was a critical question looming over the entire rebellion. What was the end game? What did Spartacus actually want? This is where the story gets really complex, and where historians still argue today. What was Spartacus trying to accomplish? The ancient sources give us conflicting accounts, and they reveal deep tensions within the rebel army itself. According to most ancient historians, Spartacus's original plan was escape. He wanted to lead his followers north, out of Italy, through the Alps, and back to their homelands. For the Thracians, this meant returning to Thrace. For the Gauls and Germans in his army, it meant crossing back over the Alps to their tribal territories. The plan was simple. Win enough battles to create a corridor of escape, then get out before Rome could fully mobilize its military might against them. This would have been the smart move. Rome, while powerful, was not yet the unstoppable empire it would become. Its forces were stretched thin, dealing with conflicts in Spain and the East. If Spartacus had moved quickly and decisively, he might actually have pulled off a mass exodus. But there was a problem. Not everyone in the rebel army agreed with this plan. Crassus, the Gallic leader, and a significant portion of the army wanted to stay in Italy. They wanted to keep fighting, keep liberating slaves, keep burning Roman estates, and taking revenge on their oppressors. For them, this wasn't about escape, it was about revolution. This tension eventually caused a split. Crassus and about 30,000 followers separated from the main army and continued raiding through southern Italy. Spartacus continued north with the remainder of his forces. The split proved disastrous for Crassus. The Romans, led by the consul Gellius, caught up with his splinter force and annihilated them in battle. Crassus was killed, along with two-thirds of his army. When Spartacus learned of Crassus's death, he did something extraordinary. He forced 300 Roman prisoners to fight as gladiators in funeral games honoring Crassus. Think about the symbolism there, reversing the roles, making Romans die for entertainment just as slaves had been forced to do. It was a powerful statement, but also showed how far the rebellion had come from its original goal of escape. Because here's the thing, Spartacus reached the Alps. He made it to northern Italy. The path to freedom was open, and then inexplicably, he turned his army around and marched back south into Italy. Why? Why would he throw away the victory, the escape, the freedom he'd fought so hard for? We don't know for certain, but historians have several theories. Maybe his followers refused to leave Italy. Many of them were Italian slaves with no homeland to return to. Maybe Spartacus realized that even if they escaped Italy, they'd be hunted across Gaul and would never truly be safe. Maybe he'd lost control of the army's direction and was being carried along by the momentum of the rebellion. Or maybe, and this is the interpretation that makes him truly tragic, maybe Spartacus had started to believe he could actually win. Maybe he thought he could defeat Rome itself. If that's true, it was a fatal miscalculation. By 72 BC, the Senate finally understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a slave revolt anymore. This was a full-scale war threatening the heart of Italy. Spartacus's army was now estimated at 70,000 to 120,000 strong, and they defeated multiple Roman forces. The Republic needed a solution, and fast. They turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome, a ruthless businessman and politician who had made his fortune through, among other things, a particularly clever scheme involving fire brigades. He'd show up at burning buildings, offer to buy them at rock-bottom prices, and only then would his private fire brigade put out the flames. That's the kind of man he was. But Crassus was also ambitious and capable. He wanted military glory to match his wealth. The war against Spartacus offered him that opportunity. He was appointed commander and given 8 legions, about 40,000 to 50,000 men, a massive force by Roman standards. Crassus immediately implemented brutal discipline. When he took command, some of his units had been defeated by Spartacus and had shown cowardice in battle. Crassus revived the ancient punishment of decimation. He divided the cowardly units into groups of 10 and had them draw lots. One man from each group was selected and beaten to death by his 9 companions. 500 men were executed this way. The message was clear. The soldiers should fear their commander more than they feared the enemy. Crassus pursued Spartacus relentlessly as the rebel army moved south toward the coast. Spartacus was trying to secure ships to cross to Sicily, hoping to reignite slave rebellions there and create a new base of operations. But the Cilician pirates he'd made deals with betrayed him, taking his payment but never delivering the ships. Trapped at the toe of Italy with Crassus's legions closing in, Spartacus made a desperate decision. He tried to build rafts to cross the narrow strait to Sicily, but rough seas made it impossible. Crassus saw his opportunity. He built a massive fortification across the entire peninsula, a wall stretching from coast to coast, 40 miles long, with trenches and palisades. He planned to trap Spartacus and starve him out. For weeks, the rebel army was besieged. Supplies dwindled, desperation grew, and then, during a stormy winter night, Spartacus made his move. The rebels filled in a section of the trench with earth and debris, and the entire army broke through Crassus's fortifications in a daring nighttime escape. Crassus was furious and embarrassed. The rebels were free again, marching north. But now something changed in the dynamics of the rebellion. The Roman Senate, panicked by Crassus's failure to contain the slaves, recalled two major armies of Italy. Pompey the Great was summoned from Spain and Lucullus from the east. Spartacus was now trapped between three major Roman armies. The noose was tightening. As multiple Roman armies converged on him, Spartacus faced an impossible situation. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of options. The rebel army, which had held together through impossible odds, began to fracture again under the pressure. A group of about 12,000 rebels, led by a commander named Gannicus and Castus, broke away from Spartacus's main force. Whether this was a strategic decision or a mutiny is unclear, but the result was catastrophic. Crassus pursued the splinter group and destroyed them utterly. Both Gannicus and Castus were killed. Spartacus's army, now reduced but still formidable, made one final attempt to break through. They needed to escape north before Pompey's legions arrived from Spain. Time was running out. Crassus, sensing his chance for glory before Pompey arrived to steal his thunder, decided to force a decisive battle. He sent his lieutenant Mummius to shadow Spartacus's army with 2 legions, but with strict orders not to engage. Mummius, eager for glory himself, ignored the orders and attacked. Spartacus turned and routed the Roman force, killing many and scattering the rest. This victory gave Spartacus a temporary reprieve, but also sealed his fate. Crassus, now determined to finish the war before Pompey's arrival, moved his entire army to engage Spartacus directly. The final battle took place in 71 BC, in Lucania in southern Italy. The exact location is debated by historians, but what happened there is recorded in brutal detail. Spartacus knew this was the end. There would be no more escapes, no more miraculous victories. This was do or die, literally. Before the battle, he reportedly killed his own horse, declaring that if they won, he'd have plenty of horses to choose from among the Roman cavalry. If they lost, he wouldn't need a horse. Think about that gesture. It was symbolic. A commander refusing the option of escape, committing completely to stand with his men. It was exactly the kind of leadership that had inspired thousands to follow him in the first place. The battle began with Spartacus attempting to break through the Roman lines and reach Crassus himself. Ancient sources tell us he was trying to cut his way directly to the Roman commander, understanding that killing Crassus might shatter the legion's morale and give the rebels a chance. He fought like a man possessed. The ancient historian Plutarch wrote that Spartacus fought like a man who knew he was doomed, but with such courage and ferocity that even his enemies were awed. He cut down centurion after centurion, fighting through waves of Roman soldiers. But the odds were impossible. The Romans had superior numbers, better equipment, and the discipline of professional soldiers. The rebel army, exhausted from months of running and fighting, began to break. Spartacus never reached Crassus. Surrounded by Roman soldiers, wounded multiple times, he was finally brought down. The sources say he fought on his knees when he could no longer stand, until the Romans overwhelmed him completely. The rebel army was shattered. Some ancient accounts put the casualties at 60,000 dead. 6,000 prisoners were taken alive. A few thousand rebels managed to escape north, only to run into Pompey's legions, which destroyed them. The great slave rebellion was over. Spartacus was dead, and Crassus had his victory. But he wasn't satisfied with just winning. He wanted to send a message so horrifying that no slave would ever dare to rebel again. After the battle, Crassus ordered something that would become one of the most infamous atrocities in Roman history: the crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way. The Appian Way was the main highway from Capua to Rome, about 120 miles long. Every 100 yards or so, a cross was erected. On each cross, a rebel was crucified. 6,000 men, dying slowly in agony, lining the road for over 100 miles. Travelers, merchants, and citizens walking from Capua to Rome would pass these dying men for days, a forest of crosses stretching to the horizon. Crucifixion was the cruelest death penalty Rome had. Victims could take days to die, suffering from exposure, dehydration, and eventually suffocating as their weakened bodies could no longer support their weight to breathe. It was designed to be both agonizing and humiliating, and it was reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. But 6,000 crucifixions? That wasn't just punishment. That was a statement. Crassus wanted every slave in Italy to see what happened to those who dared to dream of freedom. He wanted the message to be so terrifying, so overwhelming, that rebellion would become unthinkable. The crosses remained up for years afterward, slowly decaying, a perpetual reminder of Rome's power and ruthlessness. It was psychological warfare on a massive scale. And here's something chilling. Spartacus's body was never found. We don't know if he was among those crucified, buried in a mass grave, or if his body was simply lost in the chaos of battle. In a way, this uncertainty has contributed to his legend. Without a body, without a confirmed end, Spartacus remains eternal, a symbol that can never be fully killed. The irony is that while Rome won the war, they could never quite erase what Spartacus represented. His rebellion shook the Republic to its core and exposed how fragile Rome's power really was. The empire was built on slavery, and Spartacus had proven that the entire system could be threatened by those considered the lowest and most powerless. In the immediate aftermath, the political consequences rippled through Rome. Crassus received an ovation, a lesser form of triumph, for his victory, but he was bitter about the glory. Pompey, who had arrived late and merely mopped up a few thousand fleeing rebels, sent a letter to the Senate claiming that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in battle, he, Pompey, had pulled up the rebellion by its roots. This infuriated Crassus, and the rivalry between these two men would shape Roman politics for the next decade. The fear of slave rebellion transformed Roman society. Slave-owning practices became more cautious. The ratio of slaves to citizens and households was monitored more carefully. Laws were passed to make it easier to punish slaves collectively for the crimes of one. The elite class became paranoid, seeing potential rebellion in every slave's eyes. But the deeper consequences were political. The Spartacus rebellion had required enormous military resources to suppress. It showed the Senate's limitations and highlighted the need for powerful individual commanders with loyal armies. This set the stage for the rise of strongmen who would eventually tear the Republic apart. Within 20 years of Spartacus's death, Julius Caesar would cross the Rubicon. Within 50 years, the Republic would fall, and the empire would rise in its place. While Spartacus didn't cause these changes, his rebellion was a symptom of the systemic problems that would doom the Republic. So who was Spartacus, really? After examining the ancient sources in modern scholarship, we're left with a complex picture that defies simple heroic narratives. Was he fighting for the abolition of slavery? Probably not in the way we might imagine. The concept of abolition as a moral and political movement didn't exist in the ancient world. Slavery was so fundamental to ancient economies and societies that imagining a world without it was nearly impossible, even for slaves themselves. Spartacus likely would have understood freedom in more personal terms. The freedom for him and his followers to return to their homelands, to not be property, to not die in the arena. Was he a revolutionary trying to overthrow Rome? The evidence suggests no. His strategy consistently focused on escape and survival, not conquest. When he turned back from the Alps, it seems to have been out of desperation or loss of control, not ambition to rule. Was he a brilliant military commander? Absolutely. His tactical victories against trained Roman legions, his ability to organize a diverse army, his use of terrain and surprise. These mark him as genuinely talented. Military historians still study his campaigns today. Was he cruel? By Roman standards, probably not unusually so. The gladiatorial funeral games he held were brutal, but they were using Rome's own cultural practices against them. The ancient sources, which were written by Romans who hated him, don't accuse him of the kind of gratuitous atrocities that would have been highlighted to justify his destruction. Was he a hero? That depends on your definition. He was a man who refused to accept his fate as someone else's property. He fought against a system of unspeakable cruelty, with the only means available to him, violence. He led thousands of people in the most desperate bid for freedom in ancient history, and he nearly succeeded. The Romans saw him as a criminal and a threat. Later ages have seen him as a revolutionary hero, a symbol of resistance against oppression. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either extreme. What's remarkable is how Spartacus' story has been remembered and reimagined throughout history. Unlike many ancient figures, his legend only grew stronger over time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the Age of Revolutions, Spartacus became a symbol for various revolutionary movements. Socialist and communist thinkers adopted him as a proto-revolutionary, a leader of the oppressed masses rising against their exploiters. The Spartacus League in Germany during World War I took his name. Revolutionary movements across the world invoked his memory. Hollywood, of course, has had its say. The 1960 film Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas, created the most widely known version of the story, though it takes considerable liberties with history. The famous "I am Spartacus" scene, where all the captured rebels claim to be Spartacus to protect him, never happened historically. But it perfectly captures why the legend endures. It's about solidarity, dignity, and collective resistance. More recent depictions, including the Starz television series, have embraced the violence and moral complexity of the era while still centering Spartacus as a fundamentally heroic figure. But here's what's interesting. Each generation recreates Spartacus in its own image. Marxists saw him as a class warrior. Libertarians see him as an individual fighting tyranny. Anarchists see him as a symbol of horizontal organization and resistance to the state. He's been claimed by so many movements because the core of his story, slaves rising against masters, the powerless defeating the powerful, the assertion of human dignity in the face of dehumanization, resonates across time and culture. The real Spartacus would probably be unrecognizable to most people who invoke his name today. But in a way, that's the power of legend. He's become larger than the historical person, transformed into an eternal symbol. And maybe that's exactly what Rome feared most. They could kill the man, but they couldn't kill what he represented. Even after all this, huge questions remain. The fragmentary nature of ancient sources means we'll never know the full truth about Spartacus and his rebellion. We don't know where he came from. Not really. We don't know what his life was like before slavery. Did he have a family? Ancient sources mention a wife, supposedly a prophetess who convinced him of his great destiny. But we know almost nothing about her. We don't know his true motivations. Was he primarily motivated by a desire for freedom? By revenge? By the momentum of the rebellion itself? The sources give us glimpses, but the inner life of Spartacus remains mysterious. We don't even know what he looked like. Every depiction we have, from ancient art to modern film, is pure speculation. The sources don't describe his appearance in detail. And most hauntingly, we don't know where his body ended up. Was he crucified on the Appian Way with his followers? Buried by the Romans? Did he receive a warrior's burial from some escaped survivors? The man who shook Rome disappeared without a trace at the moment of his death. These gaps in knowledge are frustrating for historians, but they also contribute to the legend. Spartacus remains, in some ways, whoever we need him to be. The mystery leaves room for imagination, for hope, for different interpretations. What we do know is this. For 3 years, a man who was supposed to be invisible, powerless, and disposable became one of the most feared enemies Rome ever faced. He commanded armies, won battles, and freed thousands. He forced the greatest empire on earth to mobilize its full military might just to stop him. And even in death, his name echoed through history. inspiring countless others to believe that resistance is possible, that dignity can be claimed even in the darkest circumstances. The story of Spartacus is, ultimately, a story about the human will to be free. It's about how systems of oppression, no matter how total they seem, always contain the seeds of their own resistance. It's about courage in the face of impossible odds. But it's also a story about the brutal cost of resistance. 6,000 crosses lined the Appian Way. Tens of thousands died in battles throughout Italy. Spartacus's rebellion failed in its immediate goals. The survivors didn't gain their freedom, and the system of slavery continued for centuries. So was it worth it? That's a question without a clear answer. For the crucified rebels, in their final agonizing hours, did they regret following Spartacus? Or did they die knowing they had at least tried, that they had lived as free men, even briefly? For the slaves who remained, did the rebellion make their lives worse, subjected to increased paranoia and restrictions? Or did it give them hope, prove that resistance was possible? For history, the rebellion accomplished something Rome never intended. It made slavery visible. It forced the empire to confront the human cost of its power structure. It created a legend that would inspire rebels and revolutionaries for 2,000 years. Spartacus didn't abolish slavery. He didn't overthrow Rome. He didn't even escape to freedom. But he did something perhaps more important. He proved that those deemed subhuman by society could organize, strategize, and fight with as much courage and intelligence as any Roman general. He proved that dignity cannot be taken away, only suppressed. And he proved that even the greatest empires are built on foundations far more fragile than they appear. The rebellion lasted 3 years. The legend has lasted 2 millennia. And in that persistence, maybe Spartacus won after all. So here's a question to leave you with. If you were in Spartacus's position with the path to the Alps open and freedom within reach, would you have taken your army north to safety? Or would you have turned back, like he did, knowing it would probably lead to your death? Would you choose survival, or would you choose the impossible hope of something greater? Think about that, and let me know your answer in the comments below. If this deep dive into ancient history fascinated you, there are so many more stories like this. Forgotten rebellions, mysterious figures who changed the world, and legends that turn out to be far stranger than any fiction. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next journey into history's most compelling mysteries. And if you want to support more long-form content like this, consider becoming a channel member. Your support makes these deep investigations possible. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about individual human beings making impossible choices in the face of overwhelming odds. And sometimes, those choices echo through the ages, inspiring people they could never have imagined. Thanks for listening. Now, go make history.